welcome to Simcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging, Informatics, and Medicine. Greetings, Simcasters. As many of you already know, PACS stands for Picture, Archival, and Communication System. But the reality is, the modern-day PACS handles a lot more than just imaging data. In this episode, hosts Mohannad, Prasanth, and Ali speak with Matthew Hayes, PACS Manager for the Radiology Partners Group, and author of Chapter 5 of the second edition of the Practical Imaging Informatics textbook. In this discussion, we'll look at the historical use of PACS for managing non-imaging textual metadata and other information, and how that has transformed in the modern paradigm. DICOM structured reporting enables a vast number of complicated workflows, enabling bidirectional communication between imaging and other health information systems, as well as advanced workflows incorporating the use of artificial intelligence, advanced processing, and encounter management systems. The team will also look at the impacts this has had on the imaging clinicians, particularly with the advent of critical results reporting, follow-up recommendations, and tracking systems. This episode will kick off a series of discussions with the various chapter authors in anticipation of the new edition's publication. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Thank you, Matt, for joining us today. So our listeners would know that PACS stands for Picture, Archival, and Communication System. Why would someone want to associate non-imaging data with an imaging study? Could you help us understand, please?
Sure. Many different reasons. The evolution of PACS over the past 30 years has broadened the audience and the amount of, I'll call it, information consumers or users that take advantage of these systems now. Many non-radiologists are in their other clinical subspecialties. 10, 15 years ago, we started embarking on the whole idea of enterprise imaging, where it's no longer just the radiology like imaging application anymore. It actually does a lot more for a lot of other people. That being said, what we've found out is that in many of the different subspecialties, their workflow and their technology adoption isn't the same level that radiology's rapid adoption of technology has been. So a lot of their workflows, a lot of their processes are still based in paper and textual data. The PACS being the kind of like least common denominator system of access for all these different clinical consumers, kind of driven the need that more users needed access to this information regardless of where it was. Sometimes it can be paper scanned and digitized as an image and thrown up as a part of the imaging study. Other times it's just numerical data that just never makes it off of the PC it was acquired at and into some type of record. So that's where the advent of, conceptualizing non-imaging data as a part of the clinical data repository came into play.
Cool. Can you give us some examples of what some non-imaging objects could be? I know you mentioned a few things, paper or some numerical data, but are there other pieces that are out there?
Oh, absolutely. The biggest, most prevalent one that I interact with and that I've in my recent history in my career, ultrasound measurements. Ultrasound measurements are huge because, we take them, the techs take them, the snapshot, it becomes burned in screen capture, but you can't do anything with it. It's not like you could go into a PACS system, just copy and paste it into the medical record number or the dictation system, the resulting system, what the measure was. Then you're stuck with the radiologist or the cardiologist, whomever, going in and manually typing everything, and then they get keyboard fatigue, and you're trying to keep them in this dictation or structured report methodology. So the automation and the maturity of DICOM structured reporting, I think, has been really, really, really useful. We're expanding it into other use cases between AI and other modalities and other types of image capture, of taking the way that is minimally invasive to the technologist workflow as possible. Get the best of both worlds. Get that textual, get that measurement, that numerical quantitative data, as well as the imaging data in the same pane of glass. So being able to pre-populate reports, being able to send them to other ancillary systems, medical records, structured reports, or even dictation systems, cuts down on work that a diagnostic reader has to do in order to get relevant clinical information into a result.
So, Matt, I want to ask a naive question, and I apologize because I'm not a clinical background, haven't really done a lot of work in the hospital environment. What is the reason we put scanned documents in PACS, things like requisition forms, tech worksheets, consent? I've always found that interesting to know.
Some days I wonder this myself. There's still workflows that people adopt that are paper-based, unfortunately, and also depends on the type of institution and a lot of their culture around digitization. In one instance, I've seen the requisitions, they're still printing out requisitions. We're paperless. It's like, no, you got text running around. They use the requisitions. They put them in a folder. The folder sits in a stack somewhere in the technologist room or in some sort of processing area so they can actually visually see how much work there is. And then they'll pick up the folder and go into a reading room, put it into a different bin. And so the radiologist can get an idea of visually what their workload is. This is some years ago. However, one of the utilizations of the requisition is they used it as a patient safety check with the patient to go over, verify patient identity. You're here for chest x-ray, shoulder x-ray, head CT or whatever, and was ordered by this physician. Is this your referring physician? And they use it as a little bit of forming. Just initial here, just initial there, and just initial there, that I went over this with you. And it's a little bit of CYA. Also, sometimes looking at it, a paper scanned document inside your imaging or even turning into a hanging protocol makes a lot more quick reference than having to go into a separate part of the application to dig through order history or wherever to get to the information a reader would like to. There was other things in there that personally I didn't agree with. Back in the day, they would be scanning consent forms, face sheets, and other types of things, HIPAA privacy disclosures. And it was just like, whatever, it's just an image, it's not that big, I don't care. And they would stuff the archives full of these things. That was mainly because they tried shoehorning the PACS and also becoming a document management system, which it really didn't do. And it was horrible. And I remember the first generation PACS I worked with, it didn't do paper printing. It only did film printing. So somebody says, hey, I need, there's a legal case. Can you print out this one piece of paper? And then you hand them a film. Like, well, I want it on paper. I said, this is an imaging system. It's not a word processor. Here's your film. Technology's matured. People finally figured out plain paper printing is something we should build in our applications, which the PACS vendors eventually did to take care of that hump. But for a while, PACS was a poor man's document management system. Incorrect or, not, depending on what the organization's need were and whether, they had budget to do something like that, it did at least give them a history. And then we go and flush it anyway after whatever the term of limitation, the 7 or 10 years. It's like, well, here it goes, flush.
That's hilarious. I can only imagine like a lawyer going up and in case and be like, as you can see on this document.
Here, let me go put this on a light box.
Do they even have a light box to roll into the courtroom?
Yeah.
That's funny. Ali, I think you had another follow-up question.
I did. Thanks, Prasanth. This may be another naive question, but just really interesting here. And we may have touched on it just a little bit. But even myself, until recently, I think of DICOM as a more static kind of overlay, a file that's captured and stored for years and years. But that's not necessarily true, right? Can you walk us through examples or use cases of where DICOM is more dynamic? I think with the SR, we may have touched on this, but I think dynamic really is not a living document, but more flexible in that sense.
This is going to be an up-and-coming thing, especially with AI results. If you look at the IHE error profiles, but you also look at the interoperability in the AI showcase they had at RSNA this year, it is now a widely acknowledged pain that you have your imaging systems and you have your AI systems doing simultaneous work. That if you're in the imaging system, because that is where your radiologist, your cardiologist, your diagnostic, clinician is living, you really need to streamline the workflows to where they live. You need to meet the people where they're at. And it's our imaging systems, especially as a hospital or a clinic or an organization goes and starts purchasing multiple AI products. You can't have the broken workflow. It's like, okay, what's this? Oh, I need to go to this app, or what's this? I need to go to that app. It's not convenient and turns into a workflow nightmare for radiologists. So you have to look at the information exchange layer, and especially with IHE, where we try to utilize or adopt and adapt the things that we do have. We have HL7, we have DICOM, we have PIIRT, DICOM Web. We have a literal recipe book of ingredients and things that we can do. And being able to acknowledge, display, but also open up for updating interpretation in a standardized format. So we have a universally agreed upon DICOM SR object that everybody knows how to edit. There's things we can do in the background with version control and creating updated UIDs so we can tell the systems this isn't the current version of this document. Yes, you get additional objects. It's not like you're opening up a single object and you're going and editing the source data. I think we're still ironing a lot of those data flows and those workflows out, but I'm starting to see the vendor adoption where they're using things like SR, where secondary capture, it's a static image, and that's useful to nobody. But SR that has the content and the structure behind it is going to open up, I think, some more doors and hopefully inspire some further innovation about, what is a standard AI result transaction and what do I do with it?
Yeah, SR is really underutilized in many ways. I know some people are looking at it for like dose tracking. Do you have examples about using, cumulative dose to trigger alerts? And the second question is, because it's underutilized, why? Why do you think that it's underutilized? And what are the opportunities that are out there to fix this? Because like you said, it's so powerful. It makes your workload so much simpler if you can just pass the information right through.
Vendor compliance and governance. If we're talking just strictly, let's just pick on dose tracking, because I think dose tracking is a bit of a bad rap. And it's adopted. People say they have it. Okay, I hit the compliance. Do you have a dose tracking thing? Yes, I hit my compliance check mark for it. But many of the modalities that we need the information from don't have the capability. So the fallback is optical character recognition off of images. So PACS administrators go in and through DICOM routing and other plumbing ninjutsu, make sure that one dose page gets into the dose reporting system. They do a screen scrape, and then, okay, I have some metrics that we can start alerting and databasing on. So then you shift the work into the dose management system. Standing up, I think, alerting and a programming and warning it's definitely a multidisciplinary team, because you have to have the quality folks. You have to have the dedicated people who are going to be watching it and identifying what those thresholds are, but not only identifying the threshold. It's easy to say, well, if it goes over, then trigger an HL7 message out to the EMR, warning, or however they want to do it. The personal communication and follow-up, I think, is where there's a lot of opportunity there. Saying it's one thing to do a fire and forget message, but to have an actual conversation with an ordering physician or a performing physician saying, hey, this guy's had like 10 head CTs this week. It was a level 1 trauma severe case. It's like, are we using the right protocol? I mean, being able to have those discussions, I think, is something folks are still working on. I haven't heard of anybody that's got a killer program yet, but I know large centers are very mindful, especially with regulations and the regulatory obligations that go to it. It's like, are you tracking patient dose? Yes. Where? Well, it's in our dose tracking system. Does everybody have access to the dose tracking system? You need to evolve the conversation. Then it's like, who's responsible? Is it radiology? Is it quality? Is it safety? And formulate around that.
So I have a quick follow-up on that. I think we can talk for a long time on all these points, but specifically when we talk about automatically pushing out results, from any accepted changes in the SR to the reporting software.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something that you think is more common now? Is there any opportunity to make that more common? And I guess like a third quick question on that would be, what are barriers to preventing that? Sure. I mean, from an interoperability standpoint, is there anything that you think just practically we're going to have issues getting over to make it real?
To your first two questions, I'll say yes and yes. Is it gaining importance? Is it gaining visibility? Yes. I think there's universal acknowledgement that things are always changing and there's always going to be an update now, especially with the world of AI, trying to balance, from my opinion, from my seat, trying to balance an actionable, useful notification from just noise. Then we're just creating another level of alert fatigue. So, there's huge opportunities there. I think part of the barriers are making sure that we have a flat, interoperable playbook and how we do that. It's in progress. I hit on it before. The AIR profile and these other works in progress, I think, are starting to streamline this. We're going to be in a state where a lot of the people that are originally doing the work aren't doing all of the work, and it's going to be done by machines. Making sure that it happens in a timely fashion and it gets to the relevant parties and the information is put in relevant places, I think, are the top 3 challenges to doing that. And making sure the vendors have identified a methodology for both exporting and ingesting those kinds of messages and being able to apply particular logic in their application to do something about it. A PACS system always gets results. You see a study, they do a dictation on it, then, okay, the dictation goes back into the study, so everything's just matched up because one day it's going to become a prior. So we're used to getting HL7, but we're not used to getting HL7 while we're reading the study. So what do you do with that? The report window and the patient data section of an application, could refresh. Does it throw an alert? Those types of design and UI choices by the vendors are what's going to be critical as we adopt these technologies, because the last thing we need to do is create more busted workflows that distract rather than enhance diagnostic value. And so, for folks like me, that's our ultimate challenge. It's like, how do we help drive the efficiency? How do we drive the productivity in a positive direction and not start bombarding everybody with garbage data? This harkens back, critical results notifications. 10, 15 years ago, they had the Vocadas and all these other applications I collectively refer to as physician harassment solutions. Okay, so we're going to go in there. Okay, we're going to mark this thing critical, and it's going to send an alert, and then it's going to page the doctor. It's going to page the ordering physician. It's going to page the doctor on call. It's going to page the doctor's doctor, and it's going to keep doing it until somebody actually returns the call off of their pager or acknowledges it on the app. It's like, well, I'm nowhere near my office. I'm nowhere near my desk. Is that person that's getting the alert in a position where they can reasonably act on the information that's been given to them? Or are you just going to have this compliance thing? It's like, we got a problem. Trying to make sure we don't repeat that, I think, is going to be our next upcoming challenge. With the amount of applications, the amount of conditions, all the different things people are trying to get these applications to help improve, it's all vectors of noise.
That's very interesting, Matt. So you spoke about AI, and you also spoke about PACS system being kind of shoehorned into this document management system. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, what role do you see PACS playing in facilitating this AI game, augmenting radiologists, other than just storing documents or objects?
Well, and that's tool set integration, I think, is going to be the most important thing out of all of this. If a practice of an organization has a tool and has the PACS. As I said before, the PACS is where the physicians live. Being able to give them access to the tools in the least amount of friction possible. AI result, there's a pane in the hanging protocols for the AI external result or whatever series description we're going to land on one day, and it's going to show information. There may be additional questions like, I don't know about this. It's like, so being able to have the physician be able to just double click onto that image and launching right into those tools is my pie in the sky hope that one day we can get to with the interactions, whether it's either RESTful calls over some type of web interface that's in the cloud somewhere, or the vendors finally exchange software libraries and development kits that go beyond just simple APIs to give that richness of the tool sets. So you're not having to totally back out, go into somewhere else, do something, then come back, and just making it as fluid as possible. The document management thing also kind of strikes a nerve with me, because just because the software can do something doesn't necessarily mean it's the right place to do it. A document management system is made for managing documents. And so you can keep those based on the encounter, during a patient visit. There's non-diagnostic information that it provides like no value, but there are things that do, like I said, that paper rec or maybe the original order that might help somebody tee up. It's like they came in for a with contrast study, but based on the indication, it should be without, and, being able to go back and justify that. And along with, putting in a protocoling sheet just to help enhance what the clinical record of that exam is. So I think things like that are relevant, but privacy disclosures, driver's licenses, an argument can be made for identity management. They yes, you want pictures of the patient in the PACS. It's like, is this your patient? Oh yeah, this is the right guy. Or versus, you land up with two guys named Smith, but they're clearly two different people in the same jacket. And then it's like, wait a minute, there may be an identity management problem here. Argument can be made for that. There was one point in time where the PACS was being touted, and even VNAs to an extent, as your one all stopping ground for anything. Genomic data was the one that I had the most challenging time trying to swallow. It's like, do you need to put it in the archive because you need some place to put the genomic data? Okay, you need a storage bin. I get that. You need something that you put context and metadata around for management and identification, all that fine. PACS has been doing that forever. We know how to classify patient study series instance, and we can do things with that. However, is genomics really going to play such like an earth-shattering pivotal role in the PACS during a time of interpretation? I mean, for oncological cases, probably. So, phenotyping and things like that in patient, but not being that deep in the clinical stack and just being a technical individual, it's like that seems like it's a lot more data than it needs to be. So, to me, the simple thing is the image has something to do with the care path that they're doing. So you have your encounters imaging, which is where, the patient's showing up for a scheduled scan or maybe an unscheduled scan in an emergency. But then you have your encounters-based workflow where the imaging is not the main reason why a visit was done, but it gives clinical visual detail about what happened during that encounter. Dermatology is a great one for that. It's like, well, I came in saying, hey, I got this thing on my arm. It's like, okay, let's take a picture of that and then follow up. It's like, you can trend possibly lesion tracking over time with that as a part of the care path. It's like, it's a different workflow, but it's still valuable, actionable clinical diagnostic information.
I know that we're kind of deep in the conversation here. Just a quick follow-up to what you said earlier. With the evolving role of PACS and all these AI tools that we're seeing, is it too early? I think this can be something intimidating for radiologists, especially with the PACS being our main point of contact. Is it too early to start training us to understand how the virtual environment is going to change, how these elements, DICOM specifically, interact with between systems, what the role is there? Is it too early to start thinking about training radiologists?
No,
and if not, when would be a good time?
No, it's not too early. I think, with increasing education, the offerings, I know SIM and many other societies are starting to, branch off and expand on their informatics training to include AI specifically, understanding the fundamentals and the data flows that are associated with AI and how it fits into your workflow with PACS, I think is now going to be very important to give radiologists the background. You don't need to get too far in the weeds where you're talking about server builds and things like that, but it's an app. AI is an application that has to fit in somewhere. Do you fit it in at the front? Do you fit it in on the back? How do you tailor the way this is going to work for your practice? And we're doing this right now. AI can do a lot of things. It can do automatic image registration up front, but the AI application has to be on the ingest side of the workflow, or you can do something ischemic analysis, COVID chest x-ray analysis, but that can happen on the back end as well after the PACS is already handed off the imaging. What is the time to relevancy for that information will help determine how you structure your data flows appropriately. Because I'm starting to find out that a lot of these AI algorithms, in order to meet their timeliness, the SLAs, they need to have the information like upfront and fast. If you don't have the processor inside the walls of your hospital. It's living in a cloud somewhere. The time from it hits the modality to their gateway or widget or orchestration engine or conduit, however you want to classify that, it has to go from that ingest point to the cloud and then back. And that adds time. Understanding the impact of that time, especially at large volumes, because during the day, hospital volume, it ebbs and it flows. And so orchestrating and architecting the infrastructure, importantly, is very critical. And we need clinical input to tell us what is the level of importance for this. It's like, yes, I have to have this when the study pops up on my reading list, or no, it's good. We can get back to it later and then, do some follow-up on it. The technology folks need that insight. And that comes from clinical experience.
Yeah, the workflow with AI is going to be somewhat difficult. Like you said, like when's it going to show up? And a lot of us, having grown up in the CAD era in Mammo, already, I'm a little wary that the computer is going to send me in the wrong direction, And as much as we're a technology loving field, I'm probably more of the Luddite of the group. Like, I don't have a Twitter account, blah, blah, blah. But you're absolutely right. This is going to make for some difficulties in workflow, and each vendor is going to have decisions on how they're going to display things. This also speaks towards workflow orchestration or work list management. So does it pop something to the top? Does it override something that somebody else had already chosen?
Right.
You do rules-based, and what's it going to work for your institution?
Exactly. And that plays directly into the interoperability talk we had beforehand. It's especially if you have a workflow orchestration engine. It's like these AI things are kicking out result messages. What does the workflow engine do with the result message? It's like having determined that. I mean, we need the RADs to tell us.
Right. So this brings up another point about, obviously, the EHR in many ways is attached, right?
Mm-hmm.
When there's an interface, right? So now you've got AI like spitting out HL7 messages. Does the EHR say, oh, I have a result, even though the radiologist hasn't gone through, but it may say like, oh, I already have a result.
Yep.
It may be a preliminary or whatever, but at least it's recognizing that there's been some sort of communication through the system. So this is non-imaging data like we're talking about here, but where can we see better improvements in this communication? Because this could go sideways fast, because the computer could say one thing, but it may not know everything, or the interpretation's off, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Again, going back to the CAD example with Mammo.
Oh, yeah. And I see a lot of parallels with CAD. I think, and this is maybe a, kind of like a little bit of a Genesis paradox kind of thing, chicken egg, however you want to classify it. It's like, number one, the radiologist has to have confidence that the application is doing its job correctly, or else it's not going to get adopted. However, if it doesn't fit within the workflow and it causes more problems than it solves, they're not going to adopt it. So trying to find out that balance between how do we make it useful while being able to keep an eye on it, that it's doing, to build that clinical confidence in there. I think that's where a lot of the tension is right now in the industry. I thought I read an article, or did read an article that I thought said the other day, the amount of AI vendors at RSNA this year was down because some folks didn't make it. I mean, they had the large pavilion in 2019, and seems there was a couple hundred vendors, but then through consolidation, mergers and acquisitions, and people just not being able to sustain themselves, the amount of players in the market is going to be shrinking. So the visibility and finally getting to the point of who's going to weed through and that has the accuracy and the confidence of the market, I think is going to unfortunately drive a lot of it. I would also argue, though, that especially for larger centers that have the development resources, that they don't exclude opportunities for people to still research and continue to grow and improve internally, and not just put it completely in the hands of third-party software developers. If you have an in-house, make sure you have those workflows and those integrations well defined that aid your in-house development team being able to deploy and research against your imaging sets. We're just at a point right now where there can't be enough brains involved to making sure that what we're doing is going to work in the long term.
So in your experience, who do you see that creates more of non-imaging data? Is it the radiologists or radiology in general, or other parts of the hospital, the other ologies, if you will?
Right now, from a non-imaging standpoint, surgery is always an interesting one because they like video, but video is kind of an image, but PACS systems are video editing suites. YouTube is far more adaptable to being able to cut, edit, and deal with like basic, simple editing functions. Otherwise, you have orthopedic surgeons just taking videos of every single study that they do that are hours on end, but they want to keep them for compliance purposes. A 6-hour MPEG video aren't exactly small and take up a lot of archiving space, especially if you're an academic institution. I've seen places where every single one of their 36 to 50 ORs have been upgraded to the latest and greatest sports bar technology, where it's just monitors all over the place. Every surgical light has a camera in it. All the doctors have cameras on them. And so when you go in, it feels like you're in a broadcasting booth rather than a surgical suite. That data's got to go somewhere. Maybe those operating room vendors have sold them an archive. Otherwise, it's like, hey, PACS, you store images. Video is kind of like an image, not diagnostic, but it's like, hey, we need to put it somewhere. And they just go over there and they start trying to dump things into there. Haven't seen a huge adoption in other audiology. Hasn't been a big thing on innovation. However, when you start getting into a lot of the other diagnostic modalities, ophthalmology scopes, especially if you're upper lower GIs or even some of your ENT imaging, which is supposed to be an upper GI, but no, that'd be sinus and ENT. Those tend to lean more towards the encounters-based side of the house. Pathology is coming up to speed like a rocket ship. They have a whole bunch of standards getting published. The Digital Pathology Alliance has a lot of guidance coming out. And I mean, I think they were able to adopt a lot of the lessons we learned in cardiology and radiology early on to, be able to get better direction and be able to use the technologies more effectively. But once again, that's imaging data. When you actually sit back and think about it, a lot of the diagnostics produce a picture. It's kind of mind-numbing about that. Other than like labs and chemistry, your next big service area is surgery for many institutions. And so, radiology, cardiology, okay, imaging-based, great. Pathology, imaging-based. Then you have your basic labs, which is all quantitative, chemical data. And those EMRs have been designed pretty well to do that. It's when you get into these imaging modalities, when there's something that isn't an image, still comes into play, that you got to put it somewhere because there's probably data about the image in it somewhere.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned like these OR cameras and everything. Our institution recently purchased a bunch of point of care ultrasound for everyone, 500 of them basically. Mm-hmm. And our team basically said, yeah, you should get the archive that comes with it, because that's going to be a huge hot mess dumpster fire of trying to deal with all that point of care. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't have point of care or that's not important. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. Mm-hmm. I don't want people to misunderstand me, but there's a huge workflow difference between point of care and what we do in radiology, and how each different ology is going to label things, how they're going to use it, things like that. So for us to try to manage all of that, in addition to doing our day-to-day work, is going to be insane. So we wanted to at least have a buffer, because if they want to put the images from that archive into PACS, fine, we can make the transfer, but we're probably not going to have to deal with as many of them versus just 500 new instantaneously, bam, a truck shows up. You now have 500 new ultrasound.
500 new sources of data that are potentially controlled. Yeah.
Imagine if the ER got 500 new CTs. The amount of data is just going to explode.
Well, hoping the vendor put a wet bar option for your systems administrators and for that one, because that's kind of scary. I know the security guys like flipped their lids 5, 6, 7 years ago when they started handing out iPads to all the new residents and saying, okay, here's your mobile device management policy. Now we're carrying on that and we're giving modalities. We're giving imaging modalities that not only produce images, but also have those networking and those security implications as well.
And these devices plug into people's phones. It's not like the GE device that they had commercials for at least 15 years ago, I want to say. where it's a handheld. It is contained.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah. You plug this into your phone and you go to town. So now you've got, like you're talking about the security issues surrounding handing out iPads, right? Now you've got, BYOD, bring your own device. It starts layering on a lot more issues. And we're probably getting a little bit off topic from the idea of non-imaging material in PACS, but this is a challenge all of us are facing as time goes on.
Well, I'm going to throw another curveball, screwball into the mix as well. I have an idea and I have a general understanding of Butterfly, but the actual particular tidbits about the application I'm not that familiar with. So I'm going to make a gross assumption that I'm kind of hoping they offer some sort of cloud storage for these things, because you don't want these sitting on people's devices. So if there's like a direct route to like an external archive that's HIPAA secure through their application, I hope somebody's like covering the base with that, because then otherwise I do not envy your IT department one bit. And I'm very glad I don't have to work on this one, because it sounds like it could be pretty gnarly. Because if you have all these devices that are handed out on BYOD, that means all those BYOD devices need to be able to store imaging somewhere. This is where a VNA comes in very handy, or an enterprise archive, where you can dedicate a storage silo just to these devices. Here's your one bin, everybody into that pool. You're staying out of the general imaging pool, but through databasing and through the applications, you can still be able to do DICOM query retrieve for, I'll say, comparisons. If you're lucky and the ultrasound is diagnostic quality or useful, you can see them as a potential prior for maybe add something to a radiologist workflow, take it or leave it in your institution. But there's got to be some place where, I know, especially for physician CME, for the registered physician sonographer, there's credentialing and there's education requirements behind that. So trying to get that something constructively into the hands of those training individuals to make sure they can follow up and, they can demonstrate and do whatever it is. Hopefully somebody's monitoring the quality there is a big deal, especially when you hand out like 500 of them. That's like 500 potential individuals that you need to monitor, be able to give feedback to, especially training. Training is valuable when you're able to instruct people and be able to do it live, and, trying to manage that on multiple archives and, not having access to every individual cell phone is problematic.
Yeah, I believe it is. If I remember correctly, I believe it is a cloud, archive, so that material is not sitting resident on the individual's device. But I'd have to go back to double check that, because that was, again, my team said the same thing. They're like, is this going to sit on people's phones? But Mohannad, you had something else you wanted to ask.
It wasn't so much a question, just a remark, because Matt touched on a number of topics and some of them brought back some PTSD. Because you talked about, those surgery videos. And I, in a previous life, worked on a DICOM viewer, and we had to deal with those. And let's just say it was not fun. Yeah, personal opinion. Don't put those in PACS or in DICOM. But again, that's just my personal opinion. And of course, you also talked about shoehorning things into PACS and VNA. And I know things like XDS did not see a lot of implementation in the States, but in other countries like here in Canada, it was. And, there were like people running around saying that XDS was the solution to every problem under the sun. Obviously it isn't, but yeah, very interesting. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, XDS definitely, I think, in many ways help, but the XDS is only useful if the information is stored properly. So you can get the relationship data between everything, so that as long as it's qualified, validated, and registered properly, information exchange becomes so much easier. Unfortunately, a lot of it doesn't.
From a developer point of view, XDS under the hood uses SOAP technology. So in the developer community, we used to joke that please drop the SOAP. I'll stop here.
So I apologize. I'm going to change the topic to what I think can be a really frustrating use case, but I just really wanted to hear your thoughts, Matt, on this. So especially when we're looking at, making imaging protocols, naming series descriptions, and then we think about MR. I feel like you knew this was coming. You have different sequences, you have different MRs, vendors, and then you also have, studies from an outside institution that may use a different vendor, may use a different sequence nomenclature. How do we standardize this? Do we even attempt to standardize this? Because I know there have been solutions.
I'm in the middle of trying.
Okay.
So with the practice with Rad Partners and the practice that I'm at right now, we have many, 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 many client sites sending us many, 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 many information from tons of different vendors. And it only takes one client, one upgrade to break a hanging protocol. Because with the upgrade, they introduced a new protocol or a new, I'll call it, spinning rim feature functionality that adds a series number or a series description, or even worse, reverts back to the out-of-the-box protocoling. And they didn't back up their protocols to re-engineer, and all the study descriptions and series numbers are like this. We deal with this every single day. A couple of different ways to work with this, and I did see vendors at RSNA starting to scratch the surface on this kind of technology. When I talked earlier about where do you put your AI, this is a key use case for one of those where you want your AI processing to be done upfront in front of the PACS. If you route your imaging through that processor, you can have theoretically the AI do validation of what is this? Is it a CTA? Is it a CT head without contrast? What is this? And then be able to peel down in the layers of metadata. And doing a lot of conditional formatting, a lot of instruction to the AI, you can tell it okay, if these images match this criteria, then this is our metadata standard. Update all of the DICOM tags relevant to hanging protocols. This is our series descriptions, this is our series numbers, and this is what we get before we ingest it in the PACS. So you flatten and standardizing it before anybody even notices. To an extent, we do HL7 normalization in our PACS to help with the study descriptions. There's so much variability down at the series level that it makes it a complete nightmare to manage because you're always just an upgrade away from something breaking. And given the variety and the volume of how many different scanners and how many different software versions there are between these scanners and vendors, it makes it a management nightmare. And a lot of frustrated radiologists saying, this hangs right for this site, but it doesn't hang right for that side. Fix it. Well, I can't because this is what we're getting from the external sites and I don't control their modalities. Well, fix it before we get to it. And that's some of the technology approaches we're looking at today. When thinking about doing something of that nature, infrastructure and architecture are key because you need to make sure that one, that AI system is sized correctly to handle the corresponding volume you're going to stuff it into. Don't design a 2-pound system to handle 5 pounds worth of work. Make sure that the processing and the performance are there to make sure that we don't have those latency delays, because the last thing you're waiting for is some stroke case in a queue waiting to get validated, and it takes 5 to 10 minutes. That's valuable clinical time you're losing there. So the performance of these AI processors has to match accordingly to meet your requirements.
Just like a nice clothes dryer, we go into the cooling cycle now before we wrap up. So I had a totally random question for you, Matt. Does it bother you when somebody says PACS system?
Yes.
And do you think we should switch to calling it MIMPS?
No. My email is paxninja@gmail.com, and that means I have to change my email address, and I'm incredibly lazy. So that's no to MIPS. The PACS system thing was something that those lenses got shattered early on in my career. Wait, you're saying it's picture archiving and communication system? That's not right. Just say PACS. But what even infuriates me more is when we get into a disagreement, how do you qualify multiple PACS? Is it PACS or is it PACSes? I'm in a position where I have to deal with multiple application systems and multiple imaging systems. Well, the problem with the PACS is it just sounds awkward. So it's what's the plural of PACS? Is it PACS? It's kind of very mundane question. What's the plural of Prius? Number one, if you're living in a household where you have multiple Prius cars, that's a problem for you and not for me. But
Toyota actually put an official poll at the time for that.
They decided on Prii for multiple.
Prii. Yeah, because we're using Latin language formatting for Japanese-made cars. Awesome.
Yes. That's right. And for the record, Matt, I'm going to be registering mipsninja@gmail.com, and I'll sell it for you afterwards.
Well, the plural of moose is still moose. So it's doable. You have precedent there. So
yeah.
Thank you so much for talking about all the things that you did. One thing that we hadn't touched upon yet is that part of talking to you is you wrote a chapter for the new IIP book. So what's the big takeaway that you want people to get from your book chapter? And do you have any other closing thoughts about anything that we've talked about?
I think I say this to anybody that's willing to listen about anything in imaging. One, understand your workflows, because your workflows will determine how you deploy your technologies. The biggest pet peeve I have with non-imaging data is particularly with paper scanners. This is a professional thing that makes me cringe every single time I see that, when two things happen. One, your paper scanner is not getting the same modality work listing information from wherever your imaging source is. Ideally, the DICOM tag, and this is getting really far in the informatics hood, the issuer of study instance UID has to be the same. Otherwise, you run into this problem, because in the background of the database, your paper scans have one study instance UID and your images have a second study instance UID. And to end users, nobody cares, because the visualization, the display part of the PACS aggregates everything by accession number. Fine, everything's the same accession number. I don't care where it came from, where. To the end user, they don't care, which is totally justified. However, from a systems administrative nightmare, for some odd reason, if you have to get out of migrating those studies out of your original archive into a new archive, your study volumes get blown out, because you have multiple study paperwork. You can have 5 studies, but it's showing up as 10. You're trying to look at your statistical reports, trying to figure out, what am I paying for? How many studies, how long? The system maintenance mechanics and hoops you have to jump through become annoying. That's pet peeve number one. And the second clinical pet peeve, and this is for my radiologists out there, people who forget to invert their scanned documents. Because, radiologists love getting a tan every time they pull up a piece of paperwork. I know from an ergonomic standpoint, that can't be comfortable. I can't imagine how much that throws off people as they're trying to do their workflow. But it's like, okay, axial, coronal, sagittal, blind. I think that's an easy, low-hanging fruit for all of us in the imaging industry to just say, is this on? And if it is, can we fix it, just for the sake of keeping our radiologists healthy and happy? Those are the two main points. I can talk about DICOM SR for ages. If you're not sure what it is, Google it. Look at all the different reporting templates and opportunities that are out there for SR. It's not a panacea. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going to take care of 100% of our workflows, but it sure is going to help with a lot of them.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Simcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Please visit our website at siim.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.